So to dive into today's topic, which is organizational Photoshop 2.0 ironically or 0.2 realistically, but essentially a refresh on this kind of perspective approach we had, like how to look at all the like approaches that we have in the sense of like operating a bit like an organizational Photoshop. And this is like a dive that looks at how the elements could kind of compose themselves in order to get there. And from this informal introduction, we can open conversation. This is my attempt to actually have an introduction for the video people. Hello. And for now, I will also stop my video because my internet currently sucks. So I will try to save it a bit by using just the sharing a screen. But like, yeah, to start off, like, I wanted to start from this, which is like a game situation from 2 weeks ago, which Pablo was part of certainly. And if you have any comments on this, just jump in. But I wanted to kind of come in with this perspective of like what's happening here. Like here we had essentially this, like kind of as a starting point. Of course, we kind of had an area frame, can be also thought of as a scene, which we'll come to later. But like this was the first thing here, which is essentially kind of setting the scene, so to speak. But it's also like talking in the language of our recent approaches. It is a kind of a layer, and it's also a kind of a filter in its nature. That it's a layer in the sense that, well, it could be in this context or other context. Its position could be, suppressed or raised up, or like in terms of it could be put in a smaller context. Like we could do, like, oh, actually now we change the rules here, but we retain these rules and put them in a smaller frame in the same context. Whatever these possibilities, which people know from, or kind of are natural in something like Photoshop style layers. So there is this quality of layer and filter likeness in the sense that once it's here, it actually kind of filters the situation. Like if one says these are the moves, like these are the things you can do, then you have filtered what can happen in this. Like it's calibrated differently, this scene. So it's behaving like a filter, whether we think it or not. Like, and there was long processes on this, like how everything behaves like a filter, but actually not making note of that is rather useful and maybe even important. But then, then these things that develop, which are kind of like, in a way, they are created by moves. They follow the moves listed in the first layer of the scene, but more or less we were able, it was possible for us to change them on the fly, but nevertheless, like coming from there. But then they, of course, created pieces of their own, which are also layers, because they share the same kind of structural quality, but they're also kind of filters because I think it was me, it doesn't really matter. This was added, the image, there were the images added, then the images, a snapshot is added. In its origin, it was only white blocks, which is this image, which is why it's positioned here as a layer. In the future, they will be green and connected. I think actually it's a combination. There's also Pablo, your stuff in that, and or maybe it was yours, but okay, so it's behaving like a layer because it's close to this, but it's also behaving like a filter because, first of all, it's filtering this image. Now this image looks different because if this layer is taken as is, then this image is looked differently. Like this image within the rules, so to speak, of this filter. But it's also a filter for the rest of this scene because, like, if one takes this, then there is a possibility of thinking adding to it, as happened here, like spending time in a block makes the flora grow, which is a filter to the filter, which is filtering the image, and which is filtering the scene of interaction, which happens always, but actually kind of thinking about it like this kind of puts certain structural usefulness, or also kind of understanding of the process, I would say. So, okay, the first thing I wanted, and why I wanted to start from here is like what's happening here is also already fairly Photoshoppy by nature. And I do think the Photoshop is interesting, not just the cheesy comment, but actually kind of structurally, because it's a result of a long process of trying to find instrumentation on creating a complex conglomerate, I guess. Like, yes, it could be for people one image, but what it really is all the layers and so on and their relations. And it means that while it's not some perfect form, but there's a lot of practical knowledge in it. And while one could critique Photoshop and its approach quite a lot, and we're certainly not following to the letter, but it also contains like a lot of power, because many of its structures do have staying power also, like many further image formats follow that same structure, or have at least elements of it. They change some, but they keep the same. This is also not to say that Photoshop is kind of an originator. It's those forms existed before it, but nevertheless, like all of this is in a way like pointing out useful ways for processes. So yeah, so we're close to Photoshop in some senses. But we are also using it to organize. I mean, like the easiest way to say we're here organizing a game situation, like adding to the board is organizing what we play. But like from the long history of XORG, like if it's easy to argue that we're organizing the play, it's impossible to look at it as organizing in general. Like that's a key point here. But then if one thinks like, okay, with this kind of light approaches, we're kind of getting close to, or we're kind of somehow starting to mirror more and more this sort of like organizational Photoshop. Why not then take a look like what, like if one really entertains that perspective, what could that entail? And I will move from there to here. Can you see my fairly brown Obsidian screen?
Yeah.
Right. Nitpickily organized colors. I'm one of these persons who edits their themes anyway.
I would be one of those persons as well.
yeah, it's a quality. Like the thing is, like like editor can be anything, but it's always important for me in the editor is like not just how good the themes are, but how easily I can edit them. But yeah, anyway, it's I explained to myself that it's a question of like being like comfortable in the environment, which is probably true. But anyway, but any comments so far, like or points of discussion?
I was thinking while you were explaining how we're being filtered by the idea of being recorded and documentation.
Yes.
Of like it just filters the way we approach this recount of what happened during the play session.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to acknowledge that filter. And I'm thinking how many filters are actually not to be implemented, but to be revealed and discovered. Like maybe there's some filters already in action that we're not necessarily aware of. So yeah, I was thinking about that. But otherwise, I would be interested in going into the oxel.
Yeah, and I do think, like, to comment on that a little bit, it's like I said, everything has this sort of filtering quality. Like, in a way, like the fact that you're in a house does modify how you behave, or if you were in another place, and like it does not stop. But then the interesting point is, like, how do this sort of modifying behave, and what does it mean that you don't approach something as like an essence, like it is what it is, which is a kind of like an underlying, often unthought thought of kind of elementary forms or object-like forms or forms that we have. Is like, oh, this is this, and that can be misleading because it is just as much as actually just a modifier to the place. Like, what is essence is more a modifier, more a filter than an object. And if you then take that as basic approach, that can change things, and that's kind of where we're heading towards. But we could tackle the oxel first. Now, what is oxel besides being potentially a cool name? Like, I won't disturb Jakub and his necessary of writing, but at some point I want to ask his opinion on the name of oxel. Maybe not in this session, but like I heard Pablo's already. But yeah, oxel, which is kind of like following the do you have an like oxel as an organizational element, formed like pixel is picture element. Like, what's your gut reaction to the word?
Yeah, so I guess I have two or three which are kind of there. First one is that I was reminded when I was speaking with my supervisor in the school about the currency playground idea. So he was actually bringing the idea of pixel as kind of a basic conceptual unit that could be, or like analogy that could be used when speaking of the primitives within the currency playground thingy. So that's interesting that it's coming up also in a bit different way, but like it's coming up here. And other thing is that what is my kind of question mark is like whether pixel as a concept is carrying some kind of semantics. Because for me it does not very much, but it probably does, right? Because it is, yeah, it has yeah, anyways, but this was my question, like, does pixel carry semantics, or is it a concept that implies kind of semantic content, or how to say this? But overall, I really like the oxel meme or concept. Yeah, I find it intriguing and engagement inciting, or something like that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I do think it does carry semantic elements. Of course, every word or concept does, but the one key thing is like what it posits itself as is like an atomic, like a behavior that is similar to atomic. Of course, it kind of says it in the name. It's an element. So that's a quality that it wants to give, and this is both interesting, but then now that we'll dive into the oxel, in the oxel idea, there is actually kind of like a, wouldn't say sleight of hand, but another movement that makes it kind of behave atomically while not being an atom. And here's where the monad which we talked about before the session point comes in, but we can go into the details of that. But like, yes, there is also this element that's a cool word, which it potentially is. But I think the pathway could be thought of like that, and like this. Like this might not be the best pathway, but this is kind of a starting point. It's like, first of all, it's this word, and then it's saying, oh, it's an organizational element, like, which makes it kind of atomic. Like pixel is like the atom of pictures, and then you have voxel, like volume element, which is the atom of Qt-based Minecraft style 3D, for example, using the same format. Like, okay, so then now we're at the thought space that there is a kind of like potential atomic behavior. But then there's a lot of problematics in atomics, like in the sense of like now it means that there's this essence of a piece. So, but if we rather think of it like, it's actually just a matter of perspective. I'll be jumping a bit between this next one, which is the op or ops, or because they kind of explain each other. But the essential point is like anything can be taken as an oxel, like an organizational element. Like it does, and it's more about the question of what it frames than what's in it. So in a way, like having a framing technique offers behavioral standardization. But then if you have that frame, like what's kind of around it, so to speak, setting the standardization, you don't have to care so much of what's inside of it, which of course offers the possibility that, you know, oxel could contain infinite oxels. Or you could take some large whole thing and call it an oxel, which both is from a perspective, and from another perspective, actually, there's another oxel that kind of cuts it in a different way. But that's all right, because it's really perspective. You just have to have, like, where's the frame? Where's the framing quality of it? So, like, because from the atomic, structurally speaking, what really won't want is the standardization of unitization. But that unitization doesn't have to kind of go through the whole thing in itself. Like it makes it a unit just by making the frame, which might be abstract, but does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It sounds closer to sort of like flat ontologies, I guess, where it's like the object framing, where you can consider everything an object if it's useful for certain analysis, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of the same thing, but also like taking, like, if things are such, what can we do with that? Like, what can we do with this? Like, that it's actually perspectives, not essences. Like,
Yeah.
And which is also why there is, at the end, there is this. We can make a short jump to it. Like if the whole approach is perspective, everything depends on the point of view. Oxel is a scene, is a setting, is an op, and op is a big oxel, and so on and so on. But it just depends on however it's approached in the situation. And of course, there's some reason to approach it as an op or an oxel.
I'm having a revelatory moment with the oxels, sort of like as a framing. I'm thinking if everything can be understood as an oxel, whether that's like going back to OBOK, like a move can be an oxel, but also the game itself could be an oxel.
Yeah.
I'm thinking whether, like, because that becomes like an arbitrary line, I'm wondering what does the framing provide in terms of clarity? And I'm thinking, like in physics, how you use different mathematical models to understand subatomic physics than sort of like physics that go above the atom. If there is like if this line of defining the oxel sort of like allows for different approaches when you look inside and when you look outside, how it's done in physics, and maybe that becomes like particularly productive in the sense that you can look inside even though the inside could be also an oxel. Does that make sense? Maybe it doesn't.
Yeah. No. That's actually precisely the question of why does an oxel exist, is that there is something in the approach that offers something. And here it's kind of almost recursive about it is to say that, well, oxel could exist for organizatory reasons. Like now also meaning knowledge organization, but organizing things in places but it's the main question. It's like if it is an approach, then the question is, why is that approach relevant, or what does it provide? Which is kind of like, is it here? Yes. Like if something is established as an approach or perspective, the question changes from what it is, which is kind of like this sort of essential undercurrent that runs in almost any sense of definition. We'll come to that in a moment, definition. But it changes from what it is to what it does now in this context. And if you make that change like wholeheartedly, like you start, okay, now we really have just that approach. We really have like what it does. What does it mean for our structures, which are kind of like laden with historicality of this essentiality and like what it is, isms. So that's a question writing on this. But we'll come to, like, I think it's a topic we'll kind of visit like recurrently, like what does the oxel do here? But I would kind of like shortly say, like, its role is organizatory in the widest sense of organizing, like organizing your thoughts, organizing the table, organizing your organism. But it allows for relations. But we'll visit that. But in its support, if we look at the op, which is kind of an attempt to create, of course, it's made from the concept of ops, like, and so on. And I've been thinking of like different candidates for this sort of what is a move, right? All of these things, but as a general category. And it's a kind of a candidate for that. But there is another point to it, which was kind of like work of last week or last few days, which makes it interesting. And this is like, okay, like the op is operative concepts. Like, like OPOC is organization by operative concepts. And then the first sentence here, like definition as operation, like it's, so once again, what it does. So definition as what it does, or what you do through it. Like it, but even if you do something through it, it's really what it does question at the end. Like you're kind of like, I mean, it's kind of cold to say you're the equipment, but I think it's an interesting way of thinking about it, that you're defining, like, once again, the tradition of defining is often trying to say what it is. Oh, this is this. But if we take this, that it's actually defining something that is like a machine, it produces, like it's what it does, question. And then it might need for that, say, you or 10 people or no people or whatever, but it's really about what it does in itself. And op is what it does. But of course, then it contains a move and it contains a right. They are all things that define something as what it does. Like the key reason to define a right or change this word and that word is to address the functionality of the organization that gives the right to it. It's like, oh, this phrasing is now making people behave in wrong way, we have to change this right. This is addressing the operation already. So they are already doing that, but this is kind of like jumping then, okay, it's definition as operation. But the second point, which might be even larger, is that this is now the concept of rules. And there's been kind of this back and forth of like, okay, is the rules like a type category here, or what is that? And but I think it can be boiled down to the I don't know, an argument, I guess, is that actually all language is rule-based, or expression is rule-based, because what it does is definition, and definition is already a rule. But the key question is, like, what does it try to rule over? It might be, if it's definition, it might be saying it rules over just your expression. It might rule over itself, the expression. But if you say in an argument, you answer to somebody like, no, that's wrong because the definition of this and this concept is this and this. What you're trying to introduce is a rule into the situation, or rule-like behavior. So if language is definition, it contains rules, or consists of, that's a better way of saying, consists of or rule-like behavior. This is also why I like to use Obsidian as a basis, because it's so easy to edit. But like, yeah, if language is definition, it consists of rule-like behavior. And like, even a descriptive comment is definition, because it's defining something. It might be just defining itself, or it might be defining what you saw, or it might be defining what's happening inside of you, but that doesn't really change it. Like, it doesn't change it from, say, if somebody is trying to define something for 10 people, it's the same thing, even though that latter example would be more called a rule. So in this sense, like, whatever here is rule-like behavior in itself. So combining those, okay, let's stop there. Any comments, questions before moving forward?
Yeah, I have 2 comments, questions.
Mm-hmm.
One is, if you could, as compactly as possible, explain the difference between an oxel and an op, or the overlaps, maybe. They don't have to be different. And the other one is, how can we frame the ops in terms of actuality and potentiality that you already hinted at?
Yeah.
And I guess, because this is something we have talked before, maybe we can talk about it again. Sort of like, and this is a semantic problem, what lies as a more fundamental concept, rules or rights? So those are 3 questions, sorry.
No, it's okay. Like, let's start from the last one. I don't think one has to make it even into a contest, the rules and the rights, which is more fundamental. I would now say that, in a way, rules and rights are perspectives, and you could argue that definition, or here, in a way, the op is trying to kind of like bring this quality of definitionality being already rule-like in underline that, but that puts like the sense of definition, because description, declarative is definition, imperative is definition, essentially. Like, and this is a kind of wider sense of definition than, say, the normal, but what's in there. But like, if you take this quality, then you could say that's, I don't know if it's more fundamental, it's more general. That's maybe a better way to put it. And then you can put the rules and rights as perspectives, approaches towards it, which kind of goes to the question, like, how does the op differ from the oxel? That, in a way, like, once again, it's the matter of perspective, and then the useful manner of perspective is like, how should you approach to it? What's your focus? Like, how do you take it? Like, what is your emphasis? So in this sense, if like we'll visit this topic again, but like if oxel's role is organizational, the ops role is operational, or it's the kind of much closer to the move. It's about the like, okay, how do I operate through this? Like, okay, now this I'm taking as something I will operate through. Like, and this sets the contours of operation. This defines the machine. Or the engine that then produces, and like, but in a way, like said here, like because everything is perspective, like you can oxel is a scene or a setting or an op, or op is an oxel. But why you call it such is because you want to put the perspective, the approach, in a particular angle. You think now the approach is operation, therefore an op.
Yeah. Would you say they sort of like, they can both refer to everything, but it depends on if we're talking about actuality or about potentiality, then each one becomes more useful?
Yeah, like let's visit the potentiality and actuality, because yes, you're right, essentially. Like that's then, let me put like
for example, let me give an example and you can correct me. If we talk about a game as an oxel, we would talk about it in terms of actuality. But if we talk about a game as an op, then we talk about what that game potentially creates, for example.
Yeah, like, yeah, like roughly, I think you're essentially right. One can break it down a little bit more and say that the ops are actual towards the potential, because everything has to be defined and definition is actual. So potential kind of like almost like does not, like it always exists through like almost like actuality being its vehicle, but then you can drive the vehicle, and then the actual operation is driving the vehicle, but you need the vehicle, the actuality of the vehicle to actually drive.
Yeah,
so
it's like both of them are at the fringe of becoming the other, just at very volatile concepts.
Yeah, but this is kind of like how our thinking is overladen with this is. Like becoming the other, etc. Is it this or that? But if it's approachable, it's really like, is it now useful for me to approach it as that now my emphasis, my angle of approach is operational. And what I'm actually tailoring myself is to like figuring out the driving rules and figuring out what the driving can give, or am I figuring out, like you said, like the structure of placing things, the structure of what is the constellation in front of me, kind of thing, which would be more towards the oxel direction. So yeah, that's, and then the actual and potential, yes, like this is why it's in the op, like we kind of talked about it now, like in the sense like op is like, because its definition, it's actual, but it's actual defined towards the potential. But of course, this is just a placeholder because it's a big can of worms, because then the potential relates to the context, which can be taken as a scene or potentially a setting. This is kind of maybe work in progress, but we'll come to that. Like in a way, like operation is always in some context, which is also here. Like if language is definition, it consists of rule-like behavior. But the question then rather is rules for which context, like ruling over which context. And that is kind of the key question then, like how to well, what should also be taken into account when one starts to think about the potential, and that certainly needs some explication further, but I think it tracks quite well in this sense, and we can revisit that question when we come to the idea of the scene and the setting. But yeah, any comments on this? If that was clear enough, or
yeah, I have a comment. Maybe I'm thinking of, again, sort of like trying to draw a line to distinguish between the oxel and the op. I'm thinking, for example, in terms of moves. When we talk about moves as oxels, then we might be talking about the concept of moves, how moves are expressed, what can a move be. But when we talk about a move in the up frame, we might be talking about a specific move, a move that is taking place, a move that is already defined and has already a context, and it's inside a game or an organization.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, exactly. I think, and then the game is the scene setting. We'll come to that difference, and whether it's needed. That's an open question still. But like the game is the setting, and then that can affect the kind of potential in it. And like it works, but it's also like something to think about a bit more in this sense. But okay, so like if one then adds one of the key parts more, which is this filter layer, which I'm kind of playing around and maybe just call them frames, and then say that they behave like layers and they behave like filters. I also made, I don't know, quirky flayer, which is interesting because flaying means taking off the skin. So it's either interesting or not. I did write down like how it's interesting metaphor, because when you take off the skin, you have a separation, like a layer, but you also have a view of the insides. But it's might be weird. Like, what do you think? Like this filter layer behavior, it's kind of cumbersome to call it filter dash layer.
Yeah.
So could it be called frame or maybe something else? What's your thought on that?
I mean, I like the skinning analogy, but it has like this gruesome sort of like imagery, which is okay, it might be good. But yeah, I mean, there is, as you say, a duality that neither of them address. Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess I would have to think more about it.
Yeah, and I think it also goes to this even stylistics. Like in some ways, I'm thinking, I might be also wrong, but like I'm thinking maybe the frame is the word, and then just define the frame as behaving like layers and behaving like filters, because it is also definitely framing in quality.
Yeah, and sorry, layers are always filters. I'm thinking here like image, like Photoshop. Sometimes they're just 100% opaque and you cannot see what's below. So then you conceptualize it like as a layer more clearly. Whereas if it's it has a bit of transparency, you immediately think of it as a filter, right? So it is also a question of how much information comes through the filter, through the layer.
Yeah. I just made an addition, which this conversation made me think, like maybe make it active, maybe call it framer.
Yeah. Framer is helpful, I believe, in the sense that as when you're like framing a picture, right? When you're gonna take a photograph, that there's how do you say, explicit decision of what goes inside and what remains outside. And I believe that that boundary making is useful for this definition.
Yeah, and so yeah, like essentially let's call it the framer for now, like just to test it around. Like it is precisely now in its approach wanting to emphasize the behave like layers, behave like filters quality of things. And like in a way it's creating modularity inside a scene or a process, or like it's precisely what was happening in, now that I can change, like here, like in a way, like we say, these are all layers, all filters. Well, now we can say maybe they're all framers, but that's the same thing essentially, or wanting to say the same thing. And it's like the fact that they have this layer likeness is and filter likeness is both the kind of modularity but modularity and modifica, you cannot make that word, modificatoriness, something like this, like that, the combination of this. And in this sense, like there are relations to ops, but this is more structural. Like in a way, like if you take the op of a certain role, for example, like it becomes kind of almost like immersed in yourself, and it's not so much about like what's the frame of that role. It's actually something you take as operation, and then that becomes a quality of your operation. Of course, it's a filter because everything is a filter, so the role is filtering you. But the framing part of it is the structural possibility of creating these things that are modifying and modularizing at the same time, which allows for this kind of quality. Everything becomes a piece, but also a filter, filtering the other. So that's the kind of like that combination of layer-like and filter-like as a concept is what this framer is trying to do, and that's a kind of key structural part that helps the operation in a way, which I think is also key why it was kind of immediately enhancing when we introduced the kind of layer filter thinking to playing around with these things. And then the one thing that, okay, now I'm kind of jumping to the next topic, but maybe I'll ask, do you have any comments before I do that?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, because like, of course, now then types are like, in a way, like types could exist on this level as well, and maybe they do. But of course, they do exist like, okay, here is a framer, and it's a type role. It's a type right, it's a type. And that is kind of like creating almost species patterns. And you could call those, I don't know, frames within a frame, but now we come to almost like pragmatic questions. Like, and I think it might be useful to have the types as types, not as framers. I guess you could call them also typers, which is interesting. But like now I'm kind of muddying the waters maybe too much at the same time.
But I want to mention something because I was again like thinking about oxels and ops and potentiality and actuality, and you're doing it right here, which is referring to things as both as nouns and as verbs,
yeah.
and how that totally changes the nature of it, right?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if oxel is the equivalent of a noun, of an actuality, and op is the equivalent of a verb, of a potentiality. What do you think?
I do think like they can. The thing is, the whole noun, verb, and the actual potential, it is a kind of worms. But the key thing is like everything that kind of behaves like a noun actually contains qualities of behaving like a verb. And everything that behaves like a verb actually has qualities of behaving like a noun, which is like in a way, okay, let's take an example. If this oxel is about its organizatory potential, like that's the emphasis. Well, that's a kind of an act it does. So it is also about its potentiality in itself. And of course, the op, even though it's a verb, it's also about how it defines itself. So it has actually a large consideration of the what's actually defined there. And this is kind of like, actually, we are always dealing with this, like that kind of a dyadism. But then it's a point of actually what things you pick out, because it's actually kind of like looking at both sides of its kind of nounness and verbness, or actuality and potential, to make it into a functional unit. Like in a way, like we went through this with ops quite in more detail, like in the sense that like it's a nature of definition, but it's a definition towards operation. And this is kind of like something that is already taking into account that it has like a noun like actual like quality and verb like potential quality, and then kind of is aware of those both, but then kind of like recognizes both sides of it. And I do think this is actually true of all of this, like, and in this sense, like here the oxel is also the kind of almost like the one thing that it, yes, it organizes, but it's a sort of nesting part. It's kind of what we want to say when we want to say an organization. And I do think like that's still like work in progress. Like it's actually interesting to think about that, because it's a complex topic like this, like how like this organization is this thing we want to see, but it's also this operation inside the organization. And while we want to say there is a limit, we also recognize that there's never really like a clean contour or clean fence around it. And like maybe not to open that kind of worms too much, because I think that direction is valid, but I think it needs more detail, or it does need more detail.
Yeah. One thing I just thought about this, where I think oxels become particularly useful in the XORGian mission, is sort of like, it is a way to say like a museum and chess are both oxels, right? Like you can sort of like very easily frame a game and an organization within the same concept.
And it is actually kind of useful, because then you can think, wait a minute, also chess is part of the organization of the world, or even like, you know, organization of Germany, or whatever. This is the organizational quality again, and it does affect how Germany is organized in a minor but still existing manner, and it's contributing to it. So this is kind of actually, you're very well kind of coming to the point of what is the kind of role of the oxel, is to kind of like to point this, that in a way it's organizatory, but it's organizing as well. Like, and actually let's add, I'm making notes like for future. Quality. Okay, these are not clear, like, and they're not, but like meaning this what we were talking about now. And yes, exactly that. I think you're completely right, and this is kind of why it's kind of like making its case for its position, making its case for its existence. Like, so, but okay, like if we look at like, okay, I mean, clearly making its case for its position in the sense of like all the things that I talk in these moves and rights and even roles, and how they're all operationally emphasized things, like how do you operate things, and this is and then this framer is more like, this is kind of maybe more like slightly more practical thing almost, like it's this sort of like actually this kind of tendency of structure to behave when it's being played it's also a really interesting question in terms of meaning, but like that's a big can of worms as well, like the unitization of meaning. But anyway, but that's kind of what the framer filter dash layer does. And like also the type, it might, like one could easily put it in framer, etc. But I mean, you know from earlier conversation what it is towards is this sort of ability to create a family. It's almost like, let's put it here. I put it with question marks because I'm not sure how to, like the area definitely needs to be there. This is a word actually like this. Anyway, it's probably not a real one. It's like speciation. Like maybe I'll just remove that. Speciation. That's like it allows for this, like to create a palette, a family, like, I mean, maybe the easiest way to kind of describe that position is like, oh, like we have the palette of ops of like, and the types are roll, and we have move, and then this is a particular move, and this is a particular roll. But like the roll and the move and the write and the, say, the question is one of our types. This allows for type like types to accentuate that structural calling. And I think it's there. Do you say?
Yeah, I'm thinking of sort of like Linnean classification, and
yeah,
thinking about speciation.
Yeah.
So it, maybe like the biggest classification in Linnean terms is domain. So maybe that's useful. Sort of like type is sort of like a domain definer. Or maybe domain is even too broad, and species is the lowest level of the classification, I believe. Yeah, I don't know, maybe that's not something we want to do. That's very enlightenment of us to think that way. So I'm not sure if that's something we want to avoid, but I know where you're going with the typer.
Yeah, it's actually, no, it's a good point, because even this enlightenment is, you know, like everyone in zoology, part of biology, or is aware that the species in itself form this artificiality of like, and introduces a lot of awkwardness. But then again, we still use it because it's a useful tool. We actually make this species with the understanding that species don't really exist. Yet if we lose all the species, we lose some like it's such a kind of epistemological instrument to do this violent act of putting shapes on things. And that's the real reason. It's not about what it is, which is the kind of critique of it, of like, there is no species. It's about what it does.
Yeah.
Again.
Yeah, we use it with the knowledge of it being broken, kind of. And
yeah.
So, yeah, that's good.
Yeah, but also like, actually we use it because it does useful things. And we cannot like exactly replace it. Like, and even if we replace it, it will have similar awkwardnesses. But this is why actually it's always a question of what it does then rather than what it is, because like so like definitely linear categorization isn't, but it does things, and it allows for expression, definition of things in a manner that otherwise would be very hard to do. So but like wherever and however define this type and how to place it, or is it in like this sort of palette speciation is useful. Like it has to be in the picture, like understanding here, like, okay, in this context there is this kind of a palette is actually just a very useful practical thing. So that's why it's there. Or it has to be some kind of structure, however placed in this thing. Then, like, this is more, I mean, the scene is very clearer, but then the scene setting separation is, I think there's a lot of useful things there, but I don't, like, well, let's talk about it, because we'll see if that how to think about it. But, okay, the scene is essentially, like here defined as active acknowledged frame. Like, okay, if we go to this example, like the scene we're in is like, okay, you could say structurally the scene is like, we set this whole scene and we have these rules and that sets up the scene. But that kind of like structural part of it is useful, but even more so, it's the scene of the process. Like, this is what we acknowledge actively to be present, to be at hand, to be in the effect in itself. And this is kind of what the scene has been for a long time, like in the OBOK and so on. And I do think that's still an important part. But I wanted to like shortly say, and this kind of relates to also the conversations we had, like the separate session, on why there's this setting, and this kind of like I don't like in a way like setting could just be an oxel. It's quite possible that you don't make the concept of a setting, but actually kind of integrate it to the oxel. Open question mark that. But what it kind of is doing here is pointing out this sort of framework, or like essentially a network-like quality. It also kind of connects to, you know, things like the metaverse or distributed networks as organizational entities that are like inherently network-like. So there is this thought of seeing as a frame, but setting as a framework, like framework being a word that combines network and frame.
Yeah.
Which is, by the way, an interesting quality of it.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that.
Yeah.
I particularly like the term setting. Like I find it super like culturally charged in two very distinct ways that I like. Sort of like setting as in the setting of a romantic novel being, I don't know, 18th century England, you know, and you refer to that as a setting. But
Yeah.
you also refer to the settings in your operating system as the place where you basically change the meta kind of the game.
Yeah.
So I really like that it has both like a very narrative storytelling sort of like definition, and also like a very technical software based one. And I think that's something where we could push further into both directions simultaneously.
Yeah.
To refine the concept in XORGian terms.
Yeah, definitely. And also, like, I don't think it's an accident that like these role-playing worlds, like of course there's the Forgotten Realms and the more commercial ones, but especially if you look at the kind of internet behavior, I talked about this, like of like how people use the setting and how they develop it. How, first of all, that it's setting like, they also use the word setting, but also like what kind of behaviors thinking of it as a setting allows for, and why that's actually rather important for those things. It's like this, like not to rehash this, but maybe also for the kind of somebody watches the video, because we've talked about this a bit, but maybe not everybody knows. Like the sense of like, oh, there is the setting that allows me to place the city, and it immediately becomes sort of relational in a dynamic manner to the setting in itself. Like maybe it is in a certain place, but then I can also place, say, a certain house or merchant or whatever into that city, which is then in the setting. But then it creates all this, let's say, extra operations that I think are rather important, like the quality of, okay, like we use the same setting. I visit this merchant, and I have this set of operations there, which kind of don't come to you because maybe you start from the default definition of that shop, or maybe I write something of like maybe I don't know, the shop items updated or the shop was blown up, and you actually incorporate that into your instance of the setting. But you always instance the setting. Like the setting has this quality that the setting has, and it's always instance. Like and this is actually, while it seems super abstract, it's actually what happens in a very practical manner in this role-playing setting. So we play Forgotten Realms, and on our setting, Elminster, the big mage in Forgotten Realms, is here, and in our setting he's talking here, and he's a kind of an asshole, and in our setting he's never an asshole, but it all works because the setting is there. like it's and how this behavior of like a network that always instances, like always floats an instance from itself, like and that's structurally like the things that I talk with this metaverse, etc., are kind of like essentially behind, like are not as far as this. Like this allows for everything that is thought in terms of structural for metaverse, but it allows for much more. It's a much more flexible form. And this is why I think the setting is important, and it's definitely different from the scene. You could make an argument that it's a particular form of an oxel. Not quite sure yet, but like it's still a kind of quality that is important to be there. It's also interesting in terms of saving, which I don't know if I wrote down here. I should put it just in memory because it's in my notes. But like because setting and saving have an interesting interaction in itself. Like in a way, like this, like, oh, I saved. Like you could save as an instance, like it's still your version of the setting, but I saved this thing. But you could also maybe go and save to the setting itself. Like, yeah, there's a lot to think about there, but like it definitely plays with this sort of possibility of saving or capturing things and restoring things from save or loading.
In the last session, the extra session, I played around with the idea of calling XORG an engine for settings. What do you think of that?
I think, yeah, like in a way, like you could, I think that's definitely possible. Like I think like this is the kind of interesting thing, because in some ways I think the setting like structural qualities are needed for future of organization, like, or this kind of organization which we're thinking. Like it's like functionality you benefit from, like because you know, like it's you don't need all that functionality, you don't have to use it, but the fact that you have this sort of approach of instancing, it offers a lot of flexibility you otherwise don't have. Like and like in this sense, yes. And I do think it's like a key area of functionality for this. As where we'll go next to what does it all mean to the organization of Photoshop, maybe called oxel, or but this is kind of functionality to make that organizational Photoshop work better or be much more capable. But yeah, what's like, I mean, we already kind of opened this topic, but like definitely scene and setting are separate. Like it's more of a question of setting versus oxel, but also like I think this understanding settingness and also as a kind of calibration of the mind when people hear the word setting, they are already close by to these kind of structural thoughts, and introducing the thoughts is not such a far reach. So setting as a word has practicality to it as well. So that's another thing.
Yeah, I find it super useful in that sense. Setting as very powerful, like it immediately sort of like takes the mind to the realm of fundamental things that have some state. Like I'm thinking of like my phone settings, right?
Yeah.
Like, do you want to have dark mode enabled or not? And that's a setting. And then my whole experience of using my operating system is transformed throughout everything, my apps, my everything. So so it has like this very low level quality that I like.
Actually, that's a good point, because that's I should put this in the notes also. There is a kind of double quality, or two sides of the meaning of the setting, which is, I think, useful. And that is like the one is this setting in kind of, you could say, micro and macro, roughly speaking, in this sense of like your settings in Chrome browser or whatever. I changed this setting, but then there is this setting of Victorian England. And the funny thing is, like, I think it's actually useful because there is a lot of correspondence with these things. That in a way, the setting, the large, the macro is kind of setting of settings. And yeah, and that is actually useful in itself, but it's also important to point it out, like that these two meanings. The funny thing is, somebody asked me at some point, like, what is the kind of history of the using the word setting for this larger macro sense? Because it's, like, I think in the younger cultures, everybody who's in game cultures somehow like gets the word setting as also this Victorian England or steampunk setting or whatever. But then, like, it's actually the gaming culture that has brought it as a common word, because it seems like other cultures don't. But the interesting thing, for this reading of roles, I was reading Goffman's the presentation of self in everyday life, which is maybe 1950s, which is this sort of theatrical metaphor for the self, which I've read, I think, a couple of times earlier, but it's many years ago, so I was rereading it. And the funny thing, he uses setting in this game-like manner. So it's not just there, like he uses setting. It's actually like a not core but semi-important concept in the whole thing, in this precisely this sort of steampunk setting, Victorian setting kind of sense.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of like video games where both of the definitions collide in a very beautiful way.
Yeah.
Like if you ask someone like, what's the setting of the game? What is the setting like? And they would tell you, yeah, it's a fantasy game in like a medieval Europe kind of setting.
Yeah.
But if you would ask, what are the settings of the game? They would be like, yes, there's like 4 levels of image quality, and you can turn on anti-aliasing, and it's really good, right? Like, and nevertheless, they are kind of similar because video games are software at the service of storytelling. So of course, if you have a certain level of quality of assets, like that changes the setting, because the setting is the software. So you can go from a high definition medieval world to a very pixelated medieval world. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, now that you brought in video games, there is another point of this setting that they also reflect, which is the instancing. Like, say, let's pick Skyrim. That's a great, because it's such a, so like, so there is Skyrim, which is then everybody talks about Skyrim in general. But then if you buy Skyrim, and being a solo game, it's your instance of Skyrim. And you have your saves in your instance of Skyrim. But then you can talk through it. It's like, oh, it's annoying that this, I don't know, do they have orcs? They have this cat people, and I can't remember the names. Anyway, it's annoying in that in this town there is this and this event, and then you talk to the other person who say, yeah, it's annoying because it's part of the shared settings of Skyrim, like it's like default say event in the code of Skyrim. But you also like are quite like nimbly aware that like you have a game event that, oh, I was in this city and then two kind of guards attacked me, that there is an element that doesn't happen for others necessarily, but then they share that actually they have guards as well and they are prone to attack, like if you do crimes or illegal things. And so like, and this is all functioning with this instancing operation, like your instance of Skyrim, etc., and kind of like layers down from that inside the setting. So people actually are kind of quite aware and are quite versatile with this instancing already when they play video games. And then, but that hasn't really entered into organizational language so much, or that structure hasn't entered into organizational structure. So in a way, there is a generation who is actually very familiar with these kind of things, but there's no really kind of normal uses for it, which is interesting about the setting as well. yeah, yeah. So all of this is interesting in terms of area now, but in terms of thinking about this, like for me, this is kind of reorganizing. Like if you think of first, like to kind of slightly starting to turn the knob dial towards the kind of pragmatism, towards the organizational Photoshop, which is kind of a game-like thing anyway. But like towards it, how could it kind of appear to people? Like first, like through the OBOK. Now, if one thinks of how the OBOK lands itself here, it kind of goes inside the slots. Everything that was in OBOK is already slottable here. Like some things are slightly reconfigured, but like things are here. I think that, for example, the position of thinking of filtering is way better. It's just like everything is filtering, and it's more like a quality. And then sometimes some things help you to put emphasis on that quality, but the quality is everywhere, which is actually how things are. It's not a separate thing in this. Like and then this sort of sense of rules, like in a way that there is like things that, okay, now I'm approaching this as something operational, and it's something like that is kind of affecting my operation in itself. And then that contains, types like roles and species, which can have their own families. Like there are like different approaches to making roles and different best practices and like different interesting cases of roles, and like the same can be true of say rights and so on. So, but anyway, everything sort of from OBOK is here. But then there is kind of like this sort of additional, especially structural capabilities, like of course what we talked about, the setting, and then this oxel, which I think like it's a rather recent concept. I think it defines itself better, but we're already hovering on the area where the oxel is, and this this sort of organizational quality, and your great example how chess is oxel, and like that quality of organizing, and then like in a way that's kind of aiming itself towards being where an organization would be. So you could call your organization oxel, which is a kind of cool factor interest as well. Maybe like, or that's what I think it could be.
And we could also call it 0xl for the crypto crowd. That would land very well. But
probably, yeah. That could be like or maybe that's the lead speak way of typing.
Yes, exactly.
Like, yeah.
Very,
like,
very Haxor.
yeah.
I'm thinking in practical terms, the oxel becomes useful, as I was mentioning last session, sort of like the idea of creating these flashcards is what I call them, but I don't know if that's the best way to call them, but these unitary descriptions of, now I know those are the oxels, as a way to flatten some of the things we've discussed in XORG and just like create these modular actionable definitions. So I'm thinking like each one of these flashcards is an oxel that also describes its operative concepts as a way of like describing what the oxel is and what the oxel can do.
Yeah, and it's also like, yes, it's that, and then it's also a way to tackle this kind of very quirky qualities of the concept of organization, but kind of maybe bring them more into play. Like you were in that currency session where I mentioned this, like that the quality of organization towards mediums is kind of occupying mediums. Like like this practical example of there's not just cross media or multimedia. That's actually not covering it. Meaning like if we have a vote on in the medium of say Lumio, and then but the two people are in the same city and then they have a conversation about that. Well, that is part of the organization, and it can be very kind of practical that then leads them to make a different proposal, which then goes back to, say, Lumio or paper first, which they write in the cafe where they're meeting. And like, this is what I mean by the quality of organization as an, there's a better word than occupier of mediums. But that's what I mean. Like, it's not like you cannot say like you have a painting and it's in this medium, and you have a book and it's in this medium, and then you can put something so it's multi-medium. It's combination of this, but this has a much more dynamic quality. It actually never ends. It can always occupy and expand its mediums. Like it's adopting, let's say, adopter of mediums. And I do think like there is a play to bring that into oxel, into more like, I would almost say, playable quality and as well, like because it's a real quality of organizations. But I never heard it mentioned really. Like somebody somewhere, there's some smart people writing on organizations. Somebody somewhere has said it, but I've never heard it or read it. So in this, and it's a really key quality because it also defines a very interesting operator in mediums, and which has a lot of connotations. So that's another thing I would add to here, right? Which is kind of like it. Why I'm saying that the oxel is a potentially way to play it is like it's playing with this, like, well, everything can be the element, but also the element can be seen everywhere, like in this sense, like, which is also like what happens with this organization when it adopts a medium. Suddenly, this coffee table and this like a smaller piece of paper is at the core of the organization, which can definitely happen. Like it's because like if on the paper is then written the new proposal, which then is put into somewhere where it's voted upon, like and all of that conversation, etc., became like it kind of can, it has to. I'm making bad notes, but it has the capability to spawn nodes. In any medium. I'm not sure how like these spellings or these phrasings are not necessarily the best, but that's what I mean. Like in a way, like it actually takes an active role towards its mediums. It's not contained in it. It's an active operator with them and treats things that are outside of it as potential expansions and potential consolidations of forming it and then part of itself, which is interesting. Anyway, that's a big can of worms, but I do think there is some potential to play with that as well. But yeah,
we should start talking about can of worming as a verb.
I've been looking, like I noticed that when I kind of started using it, became useful as an instrument because it became a manager for me as a concept, because I have this trouble often, like I keep on stumbling into can of worms, like multiple cans of worms. And so the can of worms became this way of like spelling them out loud, but also at the same time potentially closing them. But then, of course, the metaphor opened up this possibility of kind of slightly opening them and then like closing them, which actually is kind of super practical.
Yeah.
Like,
it acknowledges the depth and allows you to peek and then go out of the cave without being harmed. Yeah.
Yeah. But in terms of then this practicality, like this is something that I just simply started, but like isn't there like we can also think about this, like I don't think this thing, first of all, like if we go actually practical, it's not a thing that will have one interface. It's more a game than like just this application thing. It's more like chess is a game, and then there can be many interfaces of chess. Like of course, as a game, it's more dynamic than chess is, but nevertheless, the quality. But I do think like it's the point of then of the kind of rules of these oxels, or rules that kind of create them, is to kind of facilitate the sort of situations and playable situations like this. And of course, what they should guide people to is this sort of like lightness, easiness. Like here, I think it's a good core. What should be added here is, let's say, the more almost say organizational capturing of things, which is also, and maybe placing or relating those capturings, which goes to the setting part partially. Like, you know, like, okay, this is more going to kind of thought in progress, slightly brainstorming, is like if you would have an extra consideration here is like, okay, we named this, we don't just save it, but we named this as in this context, and we placed it in this organization slash oxel here, then that and make it available, then that is interesting, and maybe give certain rights to it, that it becomes relational, and that starts to go into the right directions, like these kind of qualities, that you can like play this, but it's not just like this board, but it's actually kind of just a situation in the oxel, but then having ways to make ops to incorporate those into, organize those into the whole in interesting manners. That's kind of the, I think, a necessary part. I think it's kind of like things are kind of painted towards that already with those terms, but it's of course something that has to be explicated more.
Yeah. I mean, this is very powerful. I'm thinking, and maybe this is like a far reach, but how certain games become, and this is related to the fractal nature of oxels.
Yes.
Sort of like how games become genre. We've talked about it.
Yeah.
Like in video games, it happens all the time. But I'm also imagining there was probably a moment where there were not many board games, probably just a few, and people would call the first board game the board game because it was the only one that was played on a board. And then sort of like the boom of board games describes a general oxel of the board as an oxel. So I'm thinking, if whatever game we're making, this XORG game could become sort of like a genre of games.
Yes. It can behave like a genre. It has the kind of approach that you can, like, this is the kind of dynamic qualities that start to open up here. It's like you can always take the kind of approach perspective towards that. Now you see it as a genre, and then it starts to produce genre. Like the like underneath is like pushing this, like, okay, actually, because everything is perspective, which perspectivistic, like actually then taking, okay, let's build it purely from there. Like, let's start from there is a key thing, because it starts to open up these possibilities. Like, for example, like then like now looking at it as genre is a completely normal operation. And then you can define that op, and somebody can make another type or version of that op, of like genreification, and then that maybe creates slightly different genres. But like and I think it's rather powerful, this possibility, and there are many things hidden that are not on the table yet.
What is being revealed to me right now is that the way in which sort of like we think of, conceptualize remarkable games becoming genre, but it's actually not the games themselves, but remarkable oxels. It's like things inside those games that become genre. It's not the game itself. It's a certain patterns of those games, certain oxels of those games are what then generalize as a genre that is sort of like fertile for further miming further. So yeah, that's like, it is that pipeline of remarkable oxel turns engine turns oxel is very descriptive. It's like very oxelic.
Yeah, and I think you're capturing it actually. I think you're really hitting on one of the key points of thinking about the oxel there, like really well. Oh, which is kind of opening things that I haven't thought of. But like it's this quality of like it being organizatory inside and outside, like how chess organizes Germany, like quality, like it's a thing that has been organized for itself, but it also organizes outside. This is the kind of also where the genreification happens. It's like, oh, we actually look at the structures inward, but then they become like an effect also outwards, like other games are produced that kind of replicate those structures in itself. And here it becomes an organizer, but the oxel is both an organization, and it's also an organizer. Like it's this noun verb quality. It has both. Yeah, actually, that is an important thing to highlight, because it's a quality that organizations do more than many other things. That they are both organizations and organizers. Like it's also reflected in this how they occupy or adopt mediums.
I mean, it is actually, historically speaking, the only way things move forward, right?
Yeah.
And I don't want to frame it in terms of like progress, but like the East India Company is the first like multinational corporation, and then like further national international corps are of course influenced by it.
Sure.
Yeah. So yeah.
But also like this is also the interesting quality, or one interesting quality is like you can make the same case for language, like that. Yeah, adding a new word becomes an organizing element to the language itself, which then also starts to behave like a genre. Somebody names psychotherapy as a thing to do, but then it starts behaving like a genre when people start doing it and then developing new takes on it. So like the organizing principles, and this is kind of sort of reflected kind of sort of in, say, the Greek take on oikumene, as like this sense of organizing principle, and how it kind of like is traceable anywhere. So like so it's in a way like it's saying something about like something that is very concretely organization like, but also saying a lot about things of how all of our things in our culture have a kind of organizatory quality. Like language in and of itself is can only exist with its organization, and of course it's very dynamic and it's instanced differently for every person, but it still relies on the setting of the language, of the English language. Like if you compare now English language to Skyrim, everybody has their own Skyrim and their own English language, but there's still the setting of English language. Yeah.
Definitely here in XORG, we've developed our own instance of English.
Yes, also, but that happens because that's what happens with a language in any organization. Yes, that's like it's a quality that reflects the same structures. So in this sense, like I know that this went, of course, through, let's say, through the slightly ontological bent of this, which is my particular malady or disease of quality. But the key point is like, and I think it's apparent to you, I don't know, like for whoever views this video, is it apparent to them, is actually kind of, this is already solving things towards the organizational Photoshop or playing such a thing. Like in terms of like how to structure it, like just like finding this filter layer like approach solved a lot of the things that were in the OPOC approach, but made them much more lighter. Like this is kind of doing similar things, but in a more expanded. This is additional parts on that. Yeah. Like for example, the setting towards like, okay, how does this become a context and how it's organized into organizational things, and how that is a rich expression field in itself. Like all of these kind of come to the table. So I'm making no excuses why I'm making abstract. But it's like, yeah, I think it's actually quite close to setting there. And I do think like something like a core moment of play could still resemble quite a bit of this kind of play that we had like earlier. But then that's expanded. There are kind of expanded possibilities, especially towards how it's not just a moment, and it's not almost like just an isolated board of a game in an empty space.
Yeah.
The whole, like, which this kind of still sort of was like, I mean, yeah, like we were aware that it's in XORG and so on, but we didn't have many game elements and mechanics and operations towards that. But I think that's a big area that can be expanded.
Yes. Yes. My wish going forward would be to, and this is something I mentioned last time, to describe, define, or just like capture the oxels into these actionable modules, so that we can play organizational Photoshop, but also that others can play it in a way that maybe they don't necessarily start from a blank slate, but just like if you have like an organization already and you want to add like the saving oxel to your meetings, that you could just plug it in.
Yes, that's definitely important, even essential, and then also I think these kind of structures make that possible, like make, like, and also like there's like, this is also why I think the setting is important, like in the going back to this RPG settings, like the fact that you take this adventure where this is set in this way and you don't really have a care in the world, are you doing it right? Or at least most of the people don't. Like it's more that it's material to you, which is the same here. It's like you get this kind of setup and your point is not doing it exactly as they did or continuing from exactly the point where the others left. That's not the point. Like the point is more like it's actually useful for you to take it into your direction, but it's a kind of a platform that allows you to start from somewhere else than where you would normally start from. Like it's a starting point you wouldn't come up by yourself in itself.
Yeah.
And that's a key quality. And this kind of sharing, and I do think you're right on this, that the oxel like needing more explication and definition as this idea, which kind of combines this sense of being an element, but also pictures are made of combining pixels and kind of grow in a way almost like here we can almost think of growing from these elements. Well, maybe it combines to another elementary, which is like atoms actually appear as molecules. But anyway, like that, emphasizing that direction is really fertile potentially.
Yeah.
But that's kind of it as a kind of Yeah, like I think I mentioned, or did I mention this, other names? I wouldn't go into them. I think like I just thought of Go game organization. It's not as good anyway, but and it's I like one of the reasons is not just how cool the name is, but also the meaning it carries. And when this oxel actually then, which made me think about this, like, okay, let's do something that is elementary, but let's start from monadism or this sort of perspectivism approach, actually turn it into much more than just a name, which is important, but maybe they are interesting for other things.
I mean, I think oxel works great. I think GOM describes a particular form of organization. I don't know what that is exactly, but like, yeah, I don't see them at the same, like as descriptive and powerful.
Yeah.
But could also be useful going forward. Like XORG would be a GOM, but not all organizations are GOMs and not all games are GOMs. No, I think maybe all games are GOMs. I'm not sure.
No, it's the approach again.
Yeah.
You can always look at them as games. Like this is the key thing. Like it's a thing. Like it's a different kind of mindset. That's the thing. And the mindset, like it's almost like it takes a while to kind of entertain that mindset, because I think our mindset is still built mostly on kind of essentialism. Like because the whole our language is full of it. Like and also how we utilize the language is all this what is in kind of literal is, and then, but if you move to this, that it's a matter of the approach if they are games or not. It's not a question of is or are they. It's a question of, is it now useful for me to take the angle, the perspective of it being a game, and then is it useful, fertile? Are the real questions there? Doesn't really matter whether it was defined as such in the is form. And then what you're doing with the definition then is giving people proposals of, hey, I think this angle is interesting.
Yeah, what does it activate when it's thought of from that perspective?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's I will do now, like stopping the sharing of the screen for. But that's, I'm really like I think this is now coming together. I do think like some of the earlier weeks like solved a lot of key things, and like I think it was a key moment, this filter layer and approach in there. But I do think like now it's taking another similar step and congealing itself into like how to think about it, like how to approach it, like is
absolutely
the key. Which is an interesting thing. And now I can also try to turn on the camera. Hope my internet lasts. But yeah, like any end comments.
Let's just oxelicize ourselves into the future.
Yes, let's continue from there. I think it's a really nice landscape it's painting for the path forward. Like the vista is really fertile in itself, which is where this is a great moment to stop the recording here.